Alrighty, so week 5, learn together. We are 1 week away from our first Develop It project. So today I drafted the requirements for Dev Zero, and what I want you to do is go look at them, okay? But basically, you're going to create a program. Now, you could call it an app, you could call it code, but it needs to accomplish something. So what I'm going to do first, before I get into that, is go over the topics that we covered because we didn't cover all. So let me just go look real quick. So for this week, we only covered up to 42 in this really important section of arrays. Because in addition to learning about arrays and how to manipulate and then to push data into an array, we also learned how to loop over arrays. Okay, so these are two really important topics that you need to understand. So I know you're not surprised, but I'm going to actually show you how through walking through my code. Now, before we go look at my code, let me tell you that I rewrote my code because I started looking at it. And the more I looked at it, by the way, I found an error on it when I tried to improve it by adding just arrays and loops. Now, let me actually show you what I mean. So in this is actually the original one that I wrote. And now this code, and this is very common, is when you first look at somebody's code, it just looks confusing, especially the more code that's in there, right? But I said what I wanted to do was take what I had done in the previous weeks and just use the idea of arrays and processing the data in an array. And I actually ended up doing it. And this is a key concept, is the difference between a for loop and a for each loop. So I decided to do it both ways. Now, by the way, this was a really fun exercise for me to actually kind of go, how can I do this? It challenged me to really understand the difference, right? Because if I'm doing a for loop and I'm iterating over, and here's the array I was passing. So I passed the client, I passed this data in, and then how do I process this data was really kind of I had to wrap my head around it because of the way I had already written the code above it. And so I ended up making it much more complicated than I really needed it to be. So I stopped myself. And it was actually honestly right before I was getting ready to record. I stopped myself and I realized two things. One, I had forgotten a really important part, which was actually manipulating arrays. And I went, okay, this is a perfect time to refactor. So that's what I did. I actually made my program much shorter, much simpler, and I'm going to walk you through it, right? So I'm going to first tell you about the code so that way when we get through the walkthrough, it'll start making hopefully it'll make a little more sense because you've already seen the code. And that's honestly why, as I was reading your comments, I think it can be a little overwhelming because like anything, and this is often true when I look at somebody's code, is I have to sit with it for a minute and really read through it. Okay, so let me actually start you at the top. So what I ended up doing is I set up an array of objects, and this is a very common pattern we see in JavaScript. So it's still an array, but each entry in the array is an object. So this would represent that client's daily. Like for Monday, here's the amount of calories they took in, and here's the BMR. So I ended up making this simpler because before I was determining what that daily metabolic rate based on the activity, but I decided, no, I'm going to make this easier. And I want to tell you right now, this is a great thing to think about, is making, because here's what we often do. We bite off more than we're ready to accomplish. And that's why it's okay to simplify your code, to just make it you do what basically you need to accomplish for my project, but also for your own forwarding of your own knowledge base. Okay, so let me just slow down. I have 2 entries in here, and I could definitely put more. Like I could put Rio for Tuesday, Rio for Thursday, Jack for Tuesday, whatever. But I just put 2 so that when we walk through the code, you would see it. But it's the same basic object each time of name, calories that they actually took in, their BMR in the day. Okay, and then I set up a blank array so that once I determined what the results were, I could then push an object into that. Okay, so I have one array that's populated, I have one array that's empty, and then my code will populate the results array. So then I have, and actually here, it's like if I was to look at this function, I would have to understand what calls it. Well, what calls it is this function. Well, I better understand that. And that's why often when you're looking at functions, it's best to look at and have your calls, your invoking, like I'm calling process client data. I'm passing in that client data. Okay. So again, here's my client array. Sorry, it should be array, not client. I was calling it client, but it's client array. Okay. Again, it's an array of objects. Okay. So let's do this. Let's actually go up here and find where I process client data. So then where my client array then just is referenced as an array in this local scope. And all I'm doing is saying array for each entry in the array for each one of these. Okay. I'm going to actually come here. And all I'm going to do is I'm going to grab that by the arrow. It's because it's iterating over each one. Each individual entry in the array, then I'm going to call obj for object. I'm going to determine daily results by passing the object into this function. Okay, so I'm going to, now I have a function I'm passing in. Again, I could have called it something different, but I kept it object just to hopefully make it more clear. And I said, let total calories equal, because this is now an object I'm passing in. Object, breakfast, BF, calories, object, lunch calories, object, dinner calories. And then if the total calories is greater than what was budgeted MBR, the basic metabolic rate, I think, then, and this is kind of, this is a way I'm updating. I'm actually calling this update data function different. If I am in calorie surplus, then I call it, but what am I passing it? I'm actually passing in a new object. And this object is just going to grab the name. It's going to actually set the result. Again, these are key value pairs, objects. The idea of here's an object, I'm passing in the name, the result, and the day. And I'm pulling the day off again, that object. I'm pulling the name off that object. And then if it's not in surplus, it's in deficit. And in that case, I'm calling it again, but the difference is I'm passing in deficit in the result. Okay? And then you come down here, now that I've processed that, I'm done, and now I'm going to display the client data. So in this case, I say display client data. I pass in another array. Again, I'm just calling it instead of results. So let me just say this. When I called this function, I passed it in the object and I pushed. Forgot to talk about that. Way important part. I pushed in that object into this array. So now I have a new entry in that results array. Okay. So now down here, because now I have this populated results array, I pass that in to here, display client data, and then I say for each entry, I do 2 things. I end up calling it as a console log just so you can see that you can do both, or I called it based on the day. Or I'm sorry, based on the page. I said either pass it to display on page or just pass it to the console. Okay. All right, so let's actually now go look at this. I'm actually going to run it again. Now, again, you could just open up the file and look at it locally if you wanted. I'm going to hit inspect here. Okay. Again, This is honestly because of my recording stuff, so it's not actually an error. If I think of it, yeah, if I just hit reload here. So this shows me that I'm getting the output on the console and here. But this is the important, let's not drop that, right? So let's actually go open. This is not the one. Oh, you know what? This is from another class. Hang on just a second. Let me fix this. Sorry about that. I'm teaching Node and I had open for that. So in this case, I have my daily burn that is linked to my index file. Here's my, again, this is the same code we were looking at before, right? So this time I want to set a breakpoint right here. And I want you to do this, right? Now that I've walked you through the code, I'm going to refresh the page. It's going to halt right there. It has not called this. It shows you what the client array is, right? So it's, in this case, look up here. So we have 2, right? And we have 2 entries, 2 objects in that array, right? And remember, you can always use also this console to output that as well. And looking at that often helps you. So now I'm going to step through. I'm going to step into here. And in this case, I'm calling process client data. I'm passing in an array that has 2 entries. Okay. And now I'm going to do a for each. I'm going to step through this. So now it's showing me my first one, right? So because the OBJ is the for each is going to look at each object in the array. This is showing you the object itself, right? The one it's got. Again, if we scroll up, you can see it's got that first one. And now it's going to call on that first entry, it's going to call determine daily results by passing that object. And again, just, take your time, slow down, move. Again, what I'm doing here is placing my mouse. It shows me what that OBJ, what that variable in this case is holding. Go to the next step. So now I've passed that object into this function, and now I'm going to do some calculation. I can figure out, oh, there's my 1200. That's the total calories. And in this case, my was 1300. So I know that there's a deficit, right? And now I'm going to call update this with this custom object here, not custom, but this new object I've created, right? And so in this case, I've passed that new object. And again, look here, right? So this object was one I just created here and passed into this function. And then I said results array dot push this object. And if I do that step and I come over to here, I can actually see that I now have one entry in there. Okay. And now it's back here. So now it's finished that step, and now it's going to return to here because this is what called it. And now I'm done with that. So it calls this because it's like, okay, now let's grab the next one. Okay, let's grab Jack. And now let's do the same thing to Jack. Okay. Again, we grab the first object in the array. We processed it. We then grab the second, and now we're going to process it. Okay. So I want you to really, I can't emphasize this enough, and I wrote a little something here about this, right? Is I want you to get this because there is definitely and this is why I slowed down today, because I think sometimes I go too fast because I don't want videos to be too long. But I think we're losing a piece of what we're trying to talk about here, which is extending the concepts that we got. Okay? All right, so now that you've been through that, I'm actually going to give you, and I almost don't want to say this, but I want you to actually now think about what you're going to write. So let's go look real quick. Okay. And again, this is your job. I want you to think about this. And I did realize there's one thing I'm going to add to this. So we're on week 5. Here we are heading into Dev 0, right? I've already drafted it. I've basically just laid down some requirements for you to write. Okay, so then write code that reflects what you've learned. from the material we've covered. Here's a summary of what I want to see in your code, right? Variables, both local and global. And in this case, I need to see at least one of each of these, right? Strings, numbers, booleans, and objects. And I want to see, again, something local and something global. And this is where you just have to first write your code and then come back through here and go, like if I didn't declare a string somewhere, I'd probably Boolean to be the other one, or maybe object, right? So I could go back and could I easily just add an object somewhere or a string? Sure, right? And then at least two functions, right? And so this is where my code I'd need to work on a little bit because I showed this in week 3 attendance. Sorry, week 3 attendance, about how many folks didn't quite get this, and so I gave more detail here, right? So, but I want two functions with at least one function returning a value to another one. And my onDisplayed will not count as one of these. And then use arrays and loops and produce meaningful output. And the thing I'm going to update here is that you do need to update an array, an entry, right? So you have to, like I showed today, how I created a new array and then I used that method of push of that object into the array. And here's just the detail about, your code reviews. So here's the deal. You are on week 5, right? And there was so I want you to review these, ask me any questions. I will modify this a little bit before you see it, just to include some of those things that I was talking about. And then I want you to actually think through what your code's going to do. Okay? Because I had the benefit of mine, I'm going to show you how I want you to do this. I want you to create, and hopefully you've taken my 82 and you know how to create a markdown file. So and I want you to create a week 5 for this week. And inside of there, again, I'm making the index, mandatory. It should be pretty simple. I've gone over this. For me, I ended up, because I modified my code, I refactored it, completely rewrote it. I added a little something on my HTML, my dev here, but just linking my file. Okay. So, but here's the key, and I wanted to show you, I just started this, but here's kind of the idea. Because the more you think through what your code needs to do, the more it will help you when you go to write it. So like my code will determine if a client is in calorie surplus or calorie deficit based on their BMR and their daily calorie intake. I will store each client an array of objects, and each object represents the client data for a specific day. So I'm talking about, right, what is being stored in here. And so I want you to think through this, and then I will have 4 functions. Now I'm not quite done, but I figure I have done enough to give you an example. And I will push my code out there so you can look at this, but by the time you look at it, hopefully I've got this fleshed out a little more. But I have 4 functions: update array, determine, and process data, right? So which one did I forget? 1, 2, 3. I must have not done the one where I displayed client data. I didn't put that one on there, so I could easily put that one on there. Oh no. Oh, process but not display. So that's the idea. Again, does it have to be this for your final project? No, but this gives you a way of thinking about it. Because here's what I've noticed. The more students actually think about what their code's doing, and then they go to write it, it is going to be better code. Okay, I'm just going to tell you, it'll be better because you will have thought it out. And it really is okay to make it a little simpler, right? Because that's what I showed you today. And you may look at this and think it's not. But it really is. Look at this. Matter of fact, you can even tell just like 54 lines. My original one, right, had 79. So it is less code. It's less involved code, right? So that's okay, because again, maybe sometimes what we're thinking, what we want to accomplish, and what we're really ready to do are different, right? Because sometimes we are, what is this saying, where our eyes are bigger than our stomachs, right? We take on more than we're ready to process, or maybe we're not. And the point is, you have to find your own happy medium, but understand the requirements and then accomplish that at whatever your level is the point that I'm trying to make. I hope that makes sense. If not, right, you now have a week before this is due. I want you to, and by the way, if it was me, I'm just going to tell you, sorry, I'm talking about this, but if this was me, I would actually start working on these functions this week. And this is kind of part of why I did this, because I thought about, should I make you actually do loops and arrays? Well, you're going to have to do them by next week by dev. So I'm like, okay, how can I get you thinking about it? And again, for those of you, and many of you are, want to get a good start on this, because remember, from your grade perspective, right, how important that, like, if we were to go look, as a reminder, last thing I will cover, right, this accounts for 50% of your grade, and there's 3 of them. So calculate that out, and you can kind of figure out that how big these weigh. This is a big, so like our lectures and our learn togethers are the equal amount to the developments. That's how important these things are. All right, have a great week. I'll talk to you soon.